get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kari Murphy. On behalf of the Columbus Bar Association, I want to thank you for being here. This is our first in a series of community conversations exploring inclusive democracy. Several of you may have joined us for our previous series that was looking at race in the criminal justice system, and this is a continuation of the overall community conversation series, but we're switching our focus now to inclusive democracy. This conversation is going to focus on just a few parts of that system. We'll be looking at elections and specifically ballots, barriers, and the backbone of democracy, which is voting. Here to offer their insights from the Franklin County Board of Elections, we have Director Ed Leonard from Capital University Law School and many other places, right? We have Professor Brad Smith, and from Demos, we have Senior Counsel Naila, Awan. The format for today's conversation will begin with our guest offering a little bit of background on their experience in these areas. From there, they'll lead us through a brief overview on the topic to help sort of guide our conversation today. The remaining time we have together will be devoted to questions from you, our attendees weighing in on the things that are important to you. You can submit your questions at any time, and you'll be doing so using the Q&A function, and those questions will then be relayed to our guest today throughout the session. The Q&A function, for those of you who are new or maybe not as acquainted with the Zoom platform as you would like, if you're listening in on your phone, the Q&A function is usually right up at the top beside the leave button, so don't click that one accidentally. And then for those of you who are on your computer, it's usually at the bottom of your screen. As with many of our community conversation topics, these issues can inspire passion, conviction, anger, and even deep pain. Our community conversations are an environment where respect, curiosity, and empathy are not just encouraged, they are in fact required. Questions or comments that fall short of that requirement will not be addressed. Again, on behalf of the Columbus Bar Association, thank you for being here, for your openness and your willingness to engage in productive dialogue, and for leaning into one of the pressing issues of our day. Professor Smith, let's begin with you. One moment, Professor Smith. Let me go ahead and there we go.
Let's try again. Thank you, Kari. I'm Brad Smith. I'm the Josiah H. Blackmore II. Surely I'm not professor of law at Capital University. I'm former chair of the Federal Election Commission, and among other things, I've authored or co-authored 3 different books on election law, including a book called Voting Rights and Election Law.
Thank you. Naila, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Naila Awan. I'm a senior counsel at Demos. I have been working on voting rights and election law issues since 2014 and previously worked for the ACLU of Ohio as well. So in Ohio, I have been involved in litigation involving challenges to cuts to same-day registration and early voting in the state, challenges to ballot access laws, a class action lawsuit dealing with the ability of late jailed voters to access the ballot, as well as a case challenging Ohio's purge process known as the supplemental process. And then I've done work in a number of other states as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Director Leonard?
My name is Ed Leonard. I'm the Director of the Board of Elections. And, I'm an attorney by training, a Cleveland State law grad, and then I've served previously as the Deputy Director of the Board of Elections back in the late 90s and through the 2000 election. And then I went on to be in-house counsel for Rich Cordray, and then served as County Treasurer for 2007 to 2016, when I moved back over here to the Board of Elections to become the Director. And so I've been involved in the last 2 presidential elections here in Franklin County. And so, again, this has been a very interesting experience that we've had, essentially nonstop since the end of the 2019 general election. So hopefully I can bring some perspective.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thanks to each of you for being here. I hope that all of our attendees are as excited as I am to hear from each of our guests. We'll begin with offering the opportunity for, like I said, for each of our guests to give us a kind of an overview of the topics that they came here to discuss and also to help guide our conversation today. So Professor Smith, we will go ahead and start with you and just continue in the same order that we did for introductions.
Okay, well, thanks again, Kari. So I always view myself as the person who's here to bring the good news and the calming news to these kinds of discussions. But I want to start by just telling a little story that some people may be familiar with. It goes back to 1948 when Lyndon Johnson ran for the United States Senate against former Texas Governor Coke Stevenson. And it was an extremely close race. And to cut out most of the fun details, and there are a lot of fun details, including Texas Rangers walking through streets with sidearms on their hips to demand to look at votes and so on. In any case, at the end of the day, it was an extremely close race when at the last minute, a little county in West Texas, South Texas actually, called Duval County, returned its votes. 4,195 for Lyndon Johnson, 39 for Coke Stevenson. That is 99.1% of the voters in Duval County apparently voted for Lyndon Johnson. And then at about the same time, the votes came in from Jim Wells County, the next door county in South Texas. And one of the most interesting lists there was from what was called Precinct 13, where at the end of the day, 200 people signed up. Everybody had been signing in blue ink the entire day. That's what they had at the table. You know, when you sign in blue ink. And then all of a sudden, the ink changed to black, and 200 voters apparently lined up in alphabetical order, all of them signing in black ink and handwriting that looked very much the same all the way down. And all 202 of them voted for Lyndon Johnson. And at the end of the day, Lyndon Johnson was certified as the winner of that race by 87 votes. You know, there's a lot of irony there, including the fact that Lyndon Johnson would become a driving force behind the Voting Rights Act as president, but he probably never would have been president had he lost that race. Here's the good news. That kind of voter fraud is absolutely not going to happen today. It just does not occur, and I think would not be tolerated within the United States. Now, all of that is not to say that there's not some voter fraud that exists. There is. There is voter impersonation fraud. There is fraud with absentee ballots. There is fraud in the counting, but it's really incidental. For example, the Heritage Foundation keeps a registry of voter fraud incidents that dates back nearly 2 decades. They've got over 1,000 proven incidents, but the total votes aren't very many. If we took just one example, voter impersonation at the polls, they found a total of 13 incidents over the years amounting to 14 illegally cast ballots. Now, if we assume that, say, 10,000 violations went undetected for every one caught, we would have about 140,000 false ballots. But note that that's over several election cycles in which over 750 million ballots were cast in the United States. So that would be a voter impersonation fraud rate of about 0.2%. But even that overstates it because it doesn't include primary elections and it doesn't include off year elections, odd year elections like 2019, 2017, when, as here in Ohio, for example, we often vote on local issues and school boards and things like that. Now, voter impersonation fraud is one of the rarer types of fraud. So that, you know, there could be more. You start adding in the other categories. But the idea that there are millions of fraudulent votes in the United States is simply not supported by the evidence. Our elections are probably cleaner than they have ever been in history as a general period of time. At the same time, we often hear a lot about voter suppression, and here's the reality. There have never been fewer obstacles to voting in the United States. I mean, there are obvious changes. The 15th Amendment, providing that race could not be a factor in who gets to vote. The 19th Amendment, granting women the vote. The 24th Amendment, abolishing poll taxes. The 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18 nationally. And of course, the Voting Rights Act, which is possibly the most successful piece of legislation in American history. But voting is easier in many other ways. For example, under the Help America Vote Act passed in 2002, every state must now offer either same-day voter registration or provisional balloting. Prior to 2000, virtually no state had any form of provisional balloting. 41 states now have some form of early voting, something that did not exist in any state as recently as 25 years ago. And in 4 states, the early voting period is over 6 weeks long. All states now allow absentee voting, and 34 states and the District of Columbia have no-fault absentee balloting. And yet, there was no absentee balloting in the United States before the Civil War, when it was invented just as a device for soldiers at the front to vote. And no-fault absentee balloting did not, where you don't have to give any excuse, just apply for a ballot, you get one, did not make an appearance in the United States until California adopted it in 1980. Again, as recently as 20 years ago, there was virtually no other state with no-fault absentee balloting. So the idea that there's massive voter suppression really doesn't ring true either. For example, in the voter ID case that went to the Supreme Court, Marion County versus I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name, Crawford. Crawford versus Marion County, there was just no real evidence that people were not able to vote. As the district court found, the fact-finding court found, quote, plaintiffs have not introduced evidence of a single individual Indiana resident who will be unable to vote as a result of the voter ID law, or who will have his or her right to vote unduly burdened by its requirements. So again, as with voter fraud, are there people who sometimes are incorrectly denied the right to vote on election day? Are there people for whom some various restrictions intended to preserve order around elections find that those inhibit their ability to vote? I'm sure there are. In any country the size of the United States, with a couple 100 million voting age population, with about 150 million people who will actually vote, with over 80,000 precincts, hundreds of thousands of poll workers, there will be mistakes made. There will be isolated incidents of fraud, sometimes inadvertently, just voting incorrectly. People do it accidentally. There will be episodes where a few people are generally not allowed to vote. But for the most part, our elections actually are really in a good place. And probably the biggest problem I think we have is that we're trying too hard to make them perfect. And when you try too hard to make something perfect, sometimes that creates more problems than it's worth. For example, there are currently over 250 lawsuits that have been filed in the United States about this election. Those lawsuits add a great deal of uncertainty to what's going on. People, and then individual judges make rulings that have to be reviewed in a very tight, compressed time frame. And too often the judges are focused solely on whether one person gets to vote or whether there's one incident of fraud, rather than on simply saying, well, what are the rules? Let's enforce those. And that gives people confidence in the election and a sense that the elections are going to be right. So again, I like to view myself as the bearer of good news. Voting is obviously a central part of what we do as a democracy. If you're concerned about your vote, or if you're concerned about voting, by the way, there's no doubt, up until 6 or 8 months ago, it would not have been the least bit controversial to walk into any conference in the country of election administrators or scholars and say there's more fraud in absentee and mail ballots than in other types of voting. That's definitely true, but the fraud level there is still very, very low. Similarly, absentee ballots are rejected at a higher rate, about 1% and sometimes a bit more, but that's still a pretty low rate. But if you're concerned about making sure your ballot's counted, you're probably a little better off to brave it, go out and vote in person. But any way you look at it, again, this is a good time for elections in the United States. And if we quit screaming at one another and accusing one another of fraud and suppression without much evidence to back it up, I think we'd all be a lot happier and do a lot better at carrying out our the way in which we govern ourselves, the way in which we come together and remind ourselves of all that we have in common and the fact that we are a self-governing people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith, for those opening comments. And we are going to move on to Naila here in just a moment. I just want to remind all of our attendees that, again, your questions are submitted using the Q&A function. You do not have to wait until we open up for questions to submit those questions. In fact, I encourage you to submit your questions as they arise for you, so that we can jump right in when it's time to actually field those questions. So without further ado, Naila.
Thanks. So I'm just going to briefly touch upon some of the issues about how our election system has historically disenfranchised and how individuals are today currently disenfranchised as a result of certain practices. And when I'm talking about, the certain groups of people, that includes individuals like Black and Brown voters, working class voters, people with disabilities, and people who are housing insecure. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about voter purges and then briefly discuss some issues surrounding felony disenfranchisement and mail voting. Voter purges actually have been a tactic historically used to suppress the right to vote. And if you look back to when restrictions around registration were adopted in the late 19th century, they were trying to dictate when and where people had to register, how frequently they had to re-register, and whether the names of non-voters were periodically purged from the voter rolls. And the adoption of those rules coincided with an increase in immigration and the enfranchisement of former slaves in the US. So, you know, even after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, there were still a number of very complicated rules and laws and procedures at the local level that individuals had to navigate in order to register to vote and remain registered. It wasn't until Congress passed the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 that there was kind of a national regulation on how and when voters could be removed from the registration rolls. But if you look in recent years, there have been a number of examples of where voter purges have kind of been used as a tactic in terms of voter suppression. And, you know, one of the examples that always has been particularly stark to me is like, if you look at 2015 in Georgia, there was a majority white Hancock County Board of Elections and Registration that decided to challenge the registrations of nearly 17% of the city of Sparta's registered voters in advance of a local municipal election. And they did this by dispatching deputies with summons commanding that the challenged voters appear in person at a hearing to prove their residence or lose their voting rights. And almost all of the individuals whose registrations were challenged were Black. And then if you look at kind of what some groups are currently doing that kind of frame themselves as the American Civil Rights Union, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, and Judicial Watch, they will often send letters, threaten lawsuits, or even pursue lawsuits against jurisdictions that are, you know, predominantly jurisdictions of color, where they're telling them that their voter rolls are overinflated and they need to address them. And there's been issues with the data that has been used in those instances that courts have found to be problematic. Aside from kind of those direct kind of attacks on voter rolls, you could also run into problems where the methods selected for identifying voters who may have become ineligible are giving like a lot of false positives, essentially. And I think that, you know, an example that a lot of people here are probably familiar with is, for instance, Ohio's supplemental process, where Ohio has used a voter's failure to vote over a 2-year period as an indicia that that voter has likely moved. And they get sent a notice. Those notices have varied. Some of them have been better than others. Some of them have been a bit confusing for people, to essentially tell them that they need to respond to that notice or vote in the following 4-year period, otherwise they'll be removed from the registration rolls. Now, because a lot of people only vote in presidential elections, that could mean that missing one election results in a voter being removed from the rolls, and actually there have been a number of individuals who have been disenfranchised in Ohio despite not having moved because they were removed under those processes. There is relief in place right now through a settlement that is providing relief to individuals who go and vote in person and cast a provisional ballot, but prior to that, there were problems with respect to that. And I think it's worth noting that the thing that using things like non-voting fails to take into account is what the other external forces are that can make voting difficult, particularly for traditionally marginalized populations. And, you know, you can think of those issues as things like lack of access to transportation, accessibility of polling locations in terms of disability access, the consolidation of polling locations, which we've seen a lot in Ohio in recent years, which means that individuals who might have at one point been able to walk to their polling location now have to drive there, or moving of early voting sites to inaccessible locations, things like inflexible work schedules where people, particularly hourly and wage workers, might not be able to stay in lines. We've seen that issue a number of times. And relatedly, the times and places where voters can cast a ballot, such as, are there evening and weekend hours available in a state? How many early voting sites do people have access to? And whether polling sites are countywide or not. With respect to felony disenfranchisement laws, those laws were first developed in response to the abolition of property holding requirements and to reduce political participation of Black voters in this country. And if you look after Reconstruction, states in the South, actually, some of them tailored their felony disenfranchisement laws to target crimes that Blacks were more likely to be prosecuted for. So for instance, if you look at Mississippi, Mississippi said that if someone was convicted for theft, you know, for stealing food, something that Black people in Mississippi at that time were more likely to be found guilty of, they would lose their right to vote. If someone was found guilty of murder, something that white individuals in Mississippi at that time were more likely to be found guilty of, they maintained their right to vote in the state. So while over time, most states have stopped distinguishing between the types of felonies people would be disenfranchised for, we as a society haven't ever kind of revisited why those laws were put into place in the first place. And given the fact that there is over-policing and over-incarceration of people of color, communities of color tend to experience reduced political power as a direct result of these sorts of punitive regimes. And it's also worth noting that as it stands today, out of the 50 US states, the 2 that have never restricted the right to vote based on felony conviction are Maine and Vermont. The 2 that by census data are the whitest in the nation. So even if you are in prison, you maintain your right to vote in those 2 states. And lastly, I think the issue that I wanted to briefly touch on, because I think it's at the top of a lot of people's minds this year with COVID, is mail-in absentee voting, right? Ohio has no excuse absentee voting. Some states don't have that, although there are a number of states that have made adjustments this year in order to provide individuals with greater access to the ballot with respect, as a result of COVID-19 and in response to that. But, you know, the things that I think people are cognizant of and looking at it in different states are the methods for requesting and returning a mail-in absentee ballot. Is there prepaid postage on those things, or do you have to go and, you know, figure out the weight of the ballot and how much you have to put on there? Can you return them by mail or in person? In Missouri, for instance, right now they are saying that people who are casting what they call mail-in ballots have to get those ballots notarized, sometimes at their local election official office, but you can't hand it in while you're there. You actually can only have it delivered by USPS mail. So you have to leave your local election official's office with your ballot, even if you got it notarized there, and then stick it in the mail and hope it's received by close of polls on election day. And then there's issues around notarization requirements, other hurdles individuals have to navigate. And, you know, I think it's something that we have to be very careful about making sure people are properly educated about how to cast those ballots, because studies have shown that first-time voters, young voters, Black voters who tend to vote in person are more likely to have their ballots rejected based on errors. And in fact, an article that was published last Thursday coming out of North Carolina said right now, the number of Black voters who are having their ballots rejected for errors compared to white voters is 2 to 1. So, you know, those are things that I think we all have to be thinking about and making sure that, like, individuals are actually there's proper education about how to fill these ballots out, because a lot of people are going to be resorting to them this year for the first time because of concerns around the pandemic. So I think that, you know, there's a question of what can be done to help address some of these things, or what the reforms are that can be put in place. And I think there's a multitude, but just to quickly list off a few things that I think are helpful reforms to think about having in place in states is, you know, early voting opportunities, particularly during non-traditional work hours, accessible polling locations, both early voting on election day, same day registration, which, you know, people who have lacked fixed addresses are better able to register and participate. In Ohio, when there was Golden Week, I know a lot of the homeless advocacy groups really relied on that time frame in order to help people register and vote simultaneously. It also provides individuals with the ability to update their registration address if something has changed, something which community groups are concerned about this year given eviction issues that people are experiencing. And also, if your name has been purged from the rolls, you can re-register and vote and have your vote counted. And then also just issues around making mail voting easier, such as having things like no excuse voting, the opportunity to notice and cure of ballots if there are mistakes, easy, clear instructions, and prepaid ballots and applications.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that overview as well. And I think that our next presenter will likely address some of those questions that we had or that people might be having about what that looks like here locally. Director Leonard, I'm going to give the floor to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some information with the group. I guess I want to talk about just so people have an understanding of the Board of Elections. I know a lot of people don't really understand the Board of Elections. They just know we run elections and that's it. But we are a bipartisan board. We're made of, our board consists of 4 members, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. They're appointed by their respective parties. Whenever we're dealing with ballot administration, there are always members of each party involved in that process. From the moment we're constructing the ballot on the computer system, it requires dual login, so a member of one party can't log in by themselves. From the ballot review process, so essentially we proofread all the ballots. Anytime the ballot production, printing, and processing of the ballots, all the testing of the ballot, every voting machine that goes out in the field is tested. When we collect applications from the post office, it's a bipartisan team. When we bring it back, when we take mail to the post office, the ballots, those are all, it's done by a bipartisan team. We have whenever live ballots whenever we're in the election cycle and live ballots are in an area of the building, that area is under double lock and key. Democrat and Republican have to be present. And then the keys are actually in a key box that you have to have your own security key code and a palm scan in order to access that key box, and only the keys that you're authorized to enter. It's controlled by magnetic locks, and so only the keys that you're authorized to access are available to you. So Democrat can only access only the Democratic keys that they have available to them, not every Democratic key, and Republicans can only access the keys that they are authorized. And so again, and we've got hundreds of staff members, bipartisan. Our full-time staff is evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. And so again, at every stage of the process, and even when ballots are returned on election night, that the poll workers have to come back in pairs so that there's party representation in the transport of that back to the Board of Elections on election night. When it comes to absentee voting, as Professor Smith had mentioned, we've been doing this a long time. This is not something new in Franklin County or in the state of Ohio. In fact, that no-fault absentee concept has been in effect in Ohio since 2006. And so we've been doing, again, no-fault absentee, that you don't have to have a particular reason. It used to be that, yeah, you had to be over 65 or you had to be out of the county, but now any voter requests it, they can get an absentee ballot. And so we've been doing this a long time. We have processes in place to check voters' signatures twice. In terms of, I know somebody with questions about signature, that the Board of Elections, our teams are looking to approve that ballot application. And so we look not only at the registration form, we'll compare the signature on the absentee application or on the absentee ballot envelope with their registration. And then if we have to, we'll go to other documents that the voter has ever submitted. If they've signed a poll book, if they've signed an absentee application for a previous election, we recognize that a voter's signature is going to change over time. And so if it's shakier than it was, you've got an older voter, or if it looks as though, again, there is a health issue that may have affected, and my sister has MS, and I know over time that signature is going to get shakier. And so our staff recognizes that. And so they're always looking for ways to ensure that we're counting that ballot and that application, not disqualifying it. And then if it's put on hold, then it gets reviewed by a bipartisan team. And again, if they are still disagreeing, then it comes to the director and deputy director. And so, and then when it comes to provisional ballot, that goes to the board. In terms of absentee, you know, some of the common mistakes that are often made is, just failing to sign it and failing to put the date of birth or the last 4 digits of a social security number or their driver's license number on either the application or on the ballot envelope itself. One of the good things about this year's redesign of the absentee ballot envelope is that actually all the many of the applications that we've been sending out have highlighted portions of, and so I'm just going to hold that out, but this is the new envelope. So on the voter identification envelope, the areas that the voter is required to fill out are now highlighted. So it makes it less likely that the voter is going to miss that. And so, and the Secretary of State's mandated these new envelopes. And I know Franklin County has gone to that. I know some counties may still be using some old stock that they have, but Franklin County decided we'll use the old stock for future elections, but for this presidential, we'll use the new stock. The nice thing about the design of the envelopes is that on the back of each envelope, whether it's the envelope that the ballot arrives in, or the envelope that the voter has to send it back in, or the envelope that the ballot itself, the voter identification envelope, they all have some points of instruction on the back of the envelope to kind of warn people, just like individuals would see on the back of their utility bill or a bank, that tells them, hey, wait, before you seal this, make sure you fill it out completely, make sure you affix the sufficient postage. And in Franklin County, because we only have a single page ballot, it is only a single first class postage stamp, and that information is in the instructions that come with the ballot. And so again, we just encourage people when they get the ballot to read the instructions. And right now we're well over, 260,000, if my memory serves me correct, in terms of how many absentees, and that was probably Tuesday afternoon, in terms of the number of absentee ballots by mail that have been requested. And that far exceeds what we've had in 2016. 2016, we had the 152,000, I believe it was, for the entire cycle of 2016, and we blew past that on Labor Day. And so we're still seeing a tremendous number of people who are exercising that opportunity to vote by mail. And what we're doing is coordinating with the post office to make sure that on Monday, October 5th, the day before early voting starts, that we're going to be delivering all the ballots that we've got in applications, and we've processed everything, that it's going to be that 260,000, that those ballots will be delivered to the post office on Monday, so that they begin getting delivered on Tuesday, so that voters have as much time as possible to get that ballot back. And again, they can send it back in the mail, but they're also able to drop off that ballot. Again, as a board, we're constrained by directives of the Secretary of State's office that govern all counties. And so some of those include the number of drop boxes we're allowed to have, the number of early voting locations we're allowed to have. I mean, believe me, in a county of 860,000 plus registered voters, I would love to have more than one voting location, early vote center, but we're constrained by directives. But again, what we're doing at the Morris Road location, and again, I think, voters, we had 83,000 voters who voted here in the last presidential election. And so what we're doing here is expanding the footprint of the early vote center so that we've got more than twice as much space as we did in 16. We've expanded into our warehouse so we can socially distance the equipment, that we can process more voters more quickly than we've ever done, so that we can minimize the amount of lines and minimize the amount of time that a voter has to spend at the early vote center. And so it's, and for us, we do have weekend hours, we do have evening hours. There are, Ohio has established consistent hours for every county, big or small. And so for the first 2 weeks, it's only weekday hours from 8 to 5. And then the third week of early voting, it goes to 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Then we have the first weekend of voting with hours on Saturday and Sunday. And then the final week of early voting, the week of 26th of October through the 30th of October, it's 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then finally, there's hours again on the last weekend of early voting. And then the very last day, if you will wait until the very last day on Monday, the day before the election, we have early voting from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. And so, and one of the other things I wanted to talk about with regard to absentee voting is some states do have constraints on when they can start processing absentee ballots that are returning. In Ohio, we've continued to expand the time in which the boards of elections are allowed to start processing ballots. And so in this year, as soon as that ballot comes back, we can review it, determine if it should be counted, and if all the material, all that information on the ballot ID envelope is correct, then that ballot can be opened, prepared for scanning, and then actually scanned before Election Day. And so that, and if there's an issue with the person's ID envelope that they forgot to put some piece of information, we can contact them immediately to let them know, hey, you forgot to fill out a portion of your absentee ID envelope, so that they can correct it before election. And then they have the opportunity, even beyond Election Day, they are giving a period of time to correct that ID envelope before we have to begin the official canvass. And so again, we have those processes in place to allow people to, again, exercise either in person, Election Day, or, so we're simultaneously conducting 3 elections every election cycle: in person on Election Day, in person early voting, and absentee by mail. And I guess the last point I wanted to make is about the process. There's a lot of talk out there about, it may be weeks before we know the results of the election, or it's going to be late into the evening. And it's like, well, but that's always been the process, and that's the normal process, and it's good for the processing of the election. On election night, we never have final official results, before 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. I mean, we're always in that midnight, 12:30, or even later. The primary was exceptionally different just because the April 28th, we weren't allowed to report any results until all results were available. But typically, and in this election especially, at 7:30 on election night, we will report every absentee ballot that's been received before Election Day, and every vote cast at the early vote center will be in the count at 7:30. That's going to be a huge number, far more than we've ever had in the past, because more people are taking advantage of early voting. But post-election, I saw a dispatch headline at one point saying, Secretary of State says we may not know the official results until weeks later. Well, that's normal. We have, Ohio law allows 21 days to certify the election, and we are waiting for absentee ballots. Any voter whose ballot is postmarked by the day before Election Day, as long as that ballot arrives within 10 days after the election, it will be counted. That's a great thing for our voters, whether it's overseas citizens, whether it's military members, or whether it's citizens right here in Franklin County who are choosing to wait till the last minute. We don't recommend it. We encourage you to try and get, but if they do, if it's postmarked on the day before Election Day, it has 10 days to arrive here. And that's good for ballot access for the voter. And the provisional ballots get counted. So if somebody shows up at the polling location on Election Day and has to vote a provisional ballot because for some reason they didn't update their registration before the deadline, or they moved from another county, or they moved within Franklin County, or they requested an absentee ballot and they didn't get it, they misplaced it, they show up at the polling location on Election Day and they have to vote a provisional ballot. Well, that period of time after election gives the boards of elections the opportunity to confirm with our neighboring counties that the voter who voted provisionally is in fact registered in their previous county, and they didn't vote in their previous county. And if it's an absentee request situation, well, that gives us 10 days to wait for that. If that absentee ballot doesn't show up in the 10 days post-election, then we'll count the provisional ballot. So all these steps are designed to afford people the opportunity to cast their ballot and to have that ballot counted. So there's nothing nefarious about it. There's nothing unusual about it. It's the normal process of making sure we get every ballot counted, and that we take time, because again, some of these elections are incredibly close. We've had contests decided by a flip of a coin because it was a tie vote. So we want to make sure that we get all of those ballots processed. And so again, I really want to push back on some of these notions that somehow this is unusual or it's going to be problematic. It may be if people start trying to claim victory when it's really a tight race, but again, from a Board of Elections standpoint, everything we're doing is in the normal course. And in that, again, it's a bipartisan team involved in that process. So with that, I guess and I guess I should talk about COVID, some of the precautions we're taking with regard to COVID-19. As I said about the early vote center, we have expanded the footprint of the early vote center so that voters, there's more social distancing. We've got plexiglass shields between the check-in roster where somebody checks in, and between the voter and the roster judge. We have hand sanitizer all over the place. We have, like I said, the machines are socially distanced. We have hygiene teams that'll be dedicated to making sure that the machines in the early vote are cleaned. One of the things we're doing, and I'll hold this up, it's just a stylus, just a simple stylus. We were able to get them in bulk for about 8 cents a piece. And every voter will be given one of these at the early vote center, and it makes the process touchless. They can sign the poll pad with it. They can touch the electronic voting machine with this stylus and make their selections on the screen. And then when they're done, they drop it in a box, and we'll clean them and reuse them just like you would the pens at your local restaurant. On election day, these will be, voter just takes it with them. We're not going to deal with it. We'll have well over 270-some thousand available. And that we have a little thing called a finger cot, which is really just a glove, a single finger glove that you can put over your finger. And same thing, that if you don't want to use one of these, but again, it'll be available for voters to use to make the actual voting process touchless. And then obviously we've got face masks, face shields, hand sanitizer. We've got disinfectant wipe for all areas of the voting location. We've assessed all of our voting locations, have taken steps to ensure we've got sufficient social distancing. At the polling locations, there will be a barrier between the roster judge and the voter so that they can have some comfort from that. And like I said, we have curbside voting available. If voters are in any way concerned, they can vote. They just we'll have people available to assist them with curbside voting. And so we're taking a lot of steps to make sure that we're ready. And as I said, with that, I'll turn it back over to you if there's questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Very informative from all of our presenters, and it gives us lots of good information to sort of mull over as we jump into questions. The first one is actually going back to the idea of whether or not it was a big deal or would be a big deal to not know the elections the result of the election on election day. And Director Leonard, you just sort of touched on that, but I wondered if any of our other presenters could talk about historically if that has ever been a big deal or how it becomes a big deal, and if that's something that concerns any of you for any other reasons that haven't already been discussed. Don't all jump in at one time.
I mean, from our perspective, we're just, we're preparing. We've been working internally and with our, throughout Franklin County and the resources we have with the city as well as the county, just to be prepared if for some reason there's any type of protests following the election because of concerns about the outcome. So when we're preparing for, and again, the city and county officials coordinate regularly with regard to the potential for unrest, regardless of the location of it. And if that location happens to be the Board of Elections, it will be prepared. But again, we keep all of the ballots and all the equipment secure. And so from that perspective, but again, it's just really in terms of what the candidates choose to do and the messages that they continue to that they voice. But again, where we would continue to voice the message about the fact that this is a process that takes time, and it's normal for it's normal. Every state has their own rules and requirements as it relates to post-election official canvassing. But in Ohio, this is a standard, and this is what we've always done.
Brad, did you have something, or excuse me, Professor Smith, did you have anything that you wanted to add? You look like you're unmuted.
You can call me Brad. Yeah, this is always a bit of an issue when there's a close race, but we live in an era of instant gratification. We all think we should know instantly, and well, we don't, and people need, again, sort of in tune with my initial message, to calm down and trust that we have people of at least reasonable integrity somewhere in the system who are managing things, and you follow the rules. What are the rules for counting ballots? What are the rules for doing a recount? I do think, one thing that discouraged me is a number of district judges and state court judges in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania have said extended the deadlines for receiving ballots. And there may be nothing, in fact, it probably is nothing, I should say, at all nefarious about that, but it's the kind of thing that are likely to make people question the results of the election. They don't see, why are these rules being extended on what's serving in this state, but not in that state. In Pennsylvania, they've done away with any postmark requirements. So in theory, in Pennsylvania, you could see how close the race was and then try to file a bunch of fraudulent ballots. Do I think this is likely to happen? No, I think I've made that pretty clear, but it's the kind of thing that reasonably gives people some doubt. And sometimes we need to accept that it's more important to have clear rules that are followed, right? And so that we get certainty and people feel comfortable that the result was fair, than to worry about whether the election was absolutely perfect in terms of, getting every, possible ballot counted, even if it missed certain deadlines or didn't conform with certain rules, as long as there's no evidence that people are using this as an effort to discriminate against particular groups or classes. So, yeah, my plea would be for everybody just to calm down. And if the election's real close on election night, or any election, there's going to be congressional elections and state elections and so on too, to just relax. Obviously we want to watch the problem or watch the process. But as Ed points out, there are a lot of safeguards, and Ohio's not alone in having those kind of bipartisan teams and opportunities for poll observers and so on. And it's not going to be helpful to start having, massive protests the first day out because people feel like, oh, they want to know the results or something like that. I don't know how you kind of get that through to people, but we need to drop this hard edge partisanship. And again, recognize that really obviously there's always improvements, but really we do pretty well. And you know what? In a worst case scenario, there will be another election, and it'll be in just 2 years, and we'll all survive till then.
Okay, thank you. Naila, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I don't think I have much on top of what's already been said. I think we are all anticipating more people to be voting by mail this election. Like, that's been borne out in how many applications different states have been receiving. And with that, the process might be a little bit slower than normal, but I think that, we have to have faith that the election officials are going to be following the processes and procedures that they have set in place and do every election. And, we might not, like Brad said, have the instant gratification that we all want, but it will get counted eventually. I do think that there might be, some additional challenges about late received ballots based on the issues we've seen already and the litigation we've seen already this year. So, I think that throws into question exactly when we'll have a result, but, I do anticipate it'll probably be later than normal before there's a clear answer.
Great, thank you. The next question, it's actually sort of a two-part question, but we've had several attendees actually ask about absentee ballots that have already been requested, but then if somebody changes their mind. So imagining that someone requested an absentee ballot, the Board of Elections acknowledged receipt of that request, can the voter then change his or her mind in person and then vote in person instead? And if so, what does that process look like?
Well, the Ohio Secretary of State just issued a directive recently that directs the boards of elections that if somebody requested an absentee ballot, but then presents to vote at the early vote center, that they'll be allowed to vote on the voting machine, that they're not going to have to vote a provisional ballot. The only time that a voter who's already requested an absentee ballot would have to vote a provisional ballot is on election day at the precinct level. So if they have requested it, that they can come to the Board of Elections and request and vote on the voting machine at the early vote center. So.
Okay. And then the other part of the question is we heard talks in the debates about unsolicited ballots being mailed out and things of that nature. In Ohio, where you had mentioned before that we're a no excuse, like that you don't have to have a particular reason to have that ballot, what would be the issue? Or can you give more information about why having an unsolicited ballot sent out would be an issue, if at all?
Well, I mean, again, under the Ohio statute, we have to have an application. Somebody has to request a ballot in order to be sent one. So we're not permitted to simply send someone an unsolicited ballot. I mean, the states that do have vote by mail have been doing it for some time and have the experience and have worked through all of the challenges associated with it. And I think were Ohio to go to some similar system, again, obviously that would have to be a decision of the General Assembly to permit that type of all mail voting. And then were that the case, then we would have to work through a lot of the scenarios that other states have already worked through as well. So I mean, the fact that some other states have already gone to an all mail system would certainly help Franklin County in the implementation, or Ohio in the implementation of an all mail system, because some of those important situations that you have to deal with when it comes to an all mail system, those other states have worked through how you address those. And so, again, in Ohio, you have to request one. And then in Ohio, they don't allow counties to send applications unsolicited. The only entity that's allowed to the only government entity that's allowed to send unsolicited absentee applications is the Secretary of State's office. So county boards of elections can't decide that we're going to do it and a neighboring county's not doing it. And so the Secretary of State is determined to make it uniform, that it comes from the Secretary of State's office.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Looking at in-person voting, how do poll observers get assigned to sites? Does the site request this if they anticipate any issues, or is that automatic? And then what training is available for somebody who might want to serve in that capacity? And then extending that further, has that historically, from any of your perspective, caused issues, the way that poll workers are assigned?
Okay, so I think you mentioned observers, but then you mentioned poll workers. In terms of poll workers, we assign poll workers. When somebody reaches out to us, we try to place them where they'd like to be placed. If they want to be in their neighborhood polling location, we'll do that. And if they're open to being placed in other areas other than in their community, then we'll place them in other parts of the county and then we have to provide political balance, and we have to make sure we have enough to again, some large locations require more poll workers. We have different categories, machine judges, roster judges who check people in, the machine judges who put people on. We have a paper ballot judge that assists people with provisional ballots. Again, we have voting location managers, deputy managers, and so there's a lot of different functions that get performed, and they receive training. This year, we're putting more training online. We have a capability where we send the poll worker a login, where they log in and they take the classes that are video classes that are pertinent to the role that they're going to perform. And then they have a segment that's in-person training. As a matter of fact, the Ohio Supreme Court has authorized that lawyers can earn up to they can earn 4 hours of continuing legal education credit for serving as a poll worker. So they have to be trained and they have to work on election day to be eligible for the credit. And we have had quite a few who've expressed interest. And but again, in terms of assigning poll workers, that's kind of our method, and we do the training of it. Observers who are, whether it's a campaign or an issue group that wants to have an observer, the rules with regard to observer require that they file in advance of election day. So they have to express that they want to be an observer. And I don't have all the details of exactly that process, but it has to be applied for in advance. And so you can't just show up on election day and say, hey, I'm here to observe the election. Doesn't work that way. They have to apply to be an observer in advance. And typically they're associated with a party or an issue campaign or a candidate. So they just can't show up. So, and they're restricted to observing. They can't question voters. They can't, stand over the shoulder of the poll worker and be challenged. Wait a minute, they simply observe. They can take notes all they want, what they saw, but they can't be interjecting themselves into the voting process. They can't be interfering in the voting process. They're not allowed to take videotape as well. So again, there are well-defined rules about what an observer can do in those polling locations. So.
Thank you. And historically speaking, has this been an issue in the past, either with having issues with poll workers or with poll observers, anything that way that that we should be aware of, where it has presented issue?
We've always had challenges recruiting poll workers just because it seems like it's a population that's older. Typically, the average age of poll workers has been rising with each election cycle. I think this election cycle, particularly in the primary, it was challenging because many of our voters were in the high-risk categories, whether health issues or age, that they chose not to work for election day, and then ultimately the primary was postponed. But in the general election, we're actually seeing a lot more individuals stepping forward to be poll workers. So again, it's been a tremendous response from the community. Some counties have really, really been struggling. And so if you're a neighboring county watching this, or you live in a neighboring county, I encourage you to do that. Franklin County, we've been doing very well. And so we're continuing to communicate with those who've stepped forward and working to place them, working to get them scheduled for training. But we really are in good shape in Franklin County. Don't anticipate that we're going to have to close or consolidate polling locations at all. Like many states did during the primary, we won't have to do that in the general election.
This question is related to that, but geared towards Naila. Have you seen becoming a poll worker as a way to sort of increase access or decrease barriers? And is that something that you would encourage for people? And if not, what are some of the things that you would encourage an everyday person to do to help to reduce barriers to voting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what Ed was pointing to was a number of issues that rose around the primary, with individuals having to step out of poll worker responsibilities who'd volunteered, and that resulted in reduced polling locations, right? And while Franklin County, it sounds like, might be in like a good place, like it sounds like some other counties might not be. And I'm actually not sure about the rules in Ohio specifically. Some states you have to live in the election jurisdiction you're volunteering, others it's a different rule. But I think that, in terms of just making sure that there's access, obviously volunteering to be a poll worker is important to make sure that you can operate the optimal number of polling sites in a state, and you don't end up seeing like what you saw in Milwaukee or in Georgia as we go into the November election. I think another thing that folks can do is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law operates election protection, which, they have attorneys answering phone calls to respond to questions from voters in the state, documenting issues that are happening, flagging things if things come up for like boards of elections members and things like that. So that's also something where individuals can volunteer with election protection to try to also provide support to voters, both during the early voting timeframes, but also on election day.
Yeah, I would want to add that whenever I do a naturalization ceremony, I always encourage the folks in that naturalization ceremony, be a poll worker. You are now, as an eligible voter, you can register to vote and you can be a poll worker, because our community needs to see that variety of ethnicity represented by somebody, who looks like a voter that's walking in. That the voter walks in and they see somebody across the table who looks like them, who speaks maybe with the same accent, somebody who is bilingual and can assist a voter that may have a challenge. And so, again, if you have the language skills, if you come from a group that you feel is not represented, we always encourage individuals to serve as poll workers to represent themselves and their communities to the broader Columbus.
Wonderful. And Professor Smith, I don't want to leave you out. Did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, nothing to add on that one.
Okay. Staying with the issue of barriers, I want to talk a little bit about voter ID laws, right? So we have them. You must have a voter ID, but here in Franklin County or in other areas, if you are aware of them, with COVID-19, the Bureau of Motor Vehicles has been flooded, to say the least, from being closed for a period of time or having limited hours, or just with the physical distancing. I know close to where I live in Gahanna, every single day there's a line wrapped around well outside into the parking lot and curving into the next business. So the question is, has there been anything done to address this as it might impact people's ability to vote because of their ability or lack thereof to be able to obtain the necessary voter ID? Or is there anything that you think should happen?
Well, one of the things I will point out is that we have received directive that if a person's driver's license is expired after March 9th, that expired driver's license is still considered to be a valid driver's license for purposes of ID. So I don't want a voter to think, oh, well, my license is expired, I can't vote, or I can't present ID. That's not the case. They can still present that valid driver's license as a valid ID. And again, there are so many other items that can qualify, whether it's a check, government check issued to you, a utility statement, a bank statement, other government ID that you may have issued to you. Try to go through. I'm sure I'm forgetting some of the other, but there really is a lot of things that can serve as for students, something that they've received from the university that's issued that has their dorm address on it, or even their off-campus address. That's sufficient for us as well. So again, if for some reason they feel like they don't have a valid ID or a valid driver's license that precludes them from voting, there are other options that they can take with them. And actually, when it comes to absentee by mail, you're not showing an ID. You're essentially filling out the envelope and put your license number on it, or your last four of your social security number and your birth date, but you don't have to photocopy your ID and put it in. You can simply put the information on the front of the ID envelope. And the same thing when you come to the early vote center. We'll ask you for an ID, but that's simply because it can speed up the process of checking you in, but you don't have to have an ID. You could fill out an application, because essentially it's no different than a absentee by mail, except you're showing up in person. So we can't require more from you if you show up in person than if you did it by mail. And so if you show up in person and you don't have an ID with you, you can fill out an application, put your last four of your social or your driver's license number, and your birth date. Fill out the application like you would if you were filling out the ID envelope, and we're going to let you vote. It's just that simple. So,
Thank you.
Kari, I'll just add, I think I agree. I've for about 15 years now periodically give a talk at law school. It's just called Voter ID, Much Ado About Nothing. I think that the laws are probably constitutional primarily because there's just never been much case showing that they really keep people from voting. And Ohio's law is not very strict. I mean, the flip side is I've never really been in favor of them as a policy matter because I don't think they serve much real purpose. But in the end, we have it. It's there now. If you don't have an ID, we've got several weeks before election day. You've got time to think about getting one. But as Ed points out, there's a lot of forms can be used. It's not like you have to have that driver's license. It's not like it has to be current if it's expired under COVID, in the COVID times. And so, I think people should just try to, you can go on the web, right, to your local Board of Elections site or to the Secretary of State site. You can find the requirements. You need to take action about it. You got plenty of time to take action, and people should do that. But otherwise, I don't think we need to be, again, worked up and having accusations hurled around like we tend to have of voter fraud and vote suppression and so
on. Okay. Anything you'd like to add, Naila?
I mean, I think that I would agree that Ohio, actually, as Ed mentioned, as Brad reiterated, has a lot of different things that you can use this ID. So having utility bills and things like that too is definitely helpful. And I think that I'm not sure actually how other states that have strict photo ID laws are treating the expired IDs too. I'm hoping that they're doing something similar to what it sounds like Ohio has selected to do, but that's something that I'll be very honest and say that I have not been keeping track of that particular issue.
Absolutely. And I think that is sort of what makes this difficult, right? Because we have what happens here locally, but it's a national election. And so things that maybe we've already addressed, so are not a concern or seem not to be a concern, perhaps have not been addressed at all in other areas. And so it's difficult to see where your focus should be. One of the questions that we've received today talks about thinking towards the mail-in ballot and the signature. And people have heard different things in the media about your signature having to match, or if it looks questionable in some way, then it might be rejected. How can somebody know what signature the state has on file? What are they looking for? What if the state doesn't have your signature on file? Can any of you talk through what that looks like, or any anecdotal things that you've heard with that in the past?
I'll add, is that, like I said, when we check signatures against what we have of record, okay, we're looking for ways to count that. And I don't think that any Board of Elections is any different than, at least in Ohio, is any different than, is we don't know how that person's voting anyway. So all we know is the person voted, and we want, we again, are bipartisan, and we're not looking to try and deny people the right to vote. We're here to help that process along. And so, again, we're not looking for ways to disqualify a signature. And again, we look at everything we have of record. I often say is that if we're disqualifying something because of a signature mismatch, I don't need a handwriting expert to tell me this thing doesn't match. I mean, sometimes it's the original signature on file is a printed signature, or essentially is printed. And now all of a sudden on this thing, you've got something cursive. And it may have been that the voter over time developed the signature, and when they first registered, they didn't have a signature. They were younger and maybe had a different. But you can update your signature. You can update your registration with the Board of Elections. That would provide an updated signature to the Board of Elections against which we could compare it. But again, we're comparing against every document that we have access to before we're going to disqualify it.
All right, wonderful.
I could.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I also think that different states do have different rules around whether there are signature match requirements. Some actually don't have as strict of requirements as other states. There's also like differing things on whether individuals are trained on like handwriting matches from state to state. So like there's like, you know, just how like election rules differ so much across the US, all of that does too. If your state has online voter registration and it's connected to like your DMV license, oftentimes that signature is the signature from your license. So that is something that folks can, like if you registered online using your driver's license information, that's probably the signature that they have. And then I would just also note that back when I was in Ohio, I did have to update my own signature, and I was able to do it at the early voting site relatively easily and quickly. So just, you know, sometimes your signature changes from 18 to when you're 30s.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and this, and I do think that you mentioned this, but just to make sure that it's clear, since we did receive the question, can you address the issue of whether extra postage is needed when returning the ballot envelope? And then going off of that, has there been any exploration of doing prepaid postage here in Ohio? Should that be something? We'll start with you, Director Leonard, but anyone else who wants to jump in is fine.
Well, again, prepay is constrained by the General Assembly in terms of whether boards of elections are allowed to prepay or issue prepaid ballot return envelopes, and so we're constrained by that. And so, but in our instructions, we'll indicate what amount of postage is required for the ballots for this year. Because it's only a one-page ballot, it's 55 cents as standard first-class postage to mail it back in. In some counties, they may have multiple pages, depending upon the activity. If there's a lot of local issues, there have been years where in Franklin County we've had multiple pages because we had, you know, City of Columbus ballot issues or multiple ballot issues on the ballot, and so it kind of went over into multiple sheets instead of one ballot page front and back. So in Franklin County this year, it's one page and it's a single first class postage.
Okay. Thank you. Looking at, we've heard a few different comments thus far, sort of nodding back to the Secretary of State, and that there are certain directives that do constrain. And so this question, you don't have to answer necessarily specifically about Ohio, but generally speaking, how much does the political leaning of each Secretary of State impact decisions on key voting processes? Should states be worried that their Secretary of State is going to put, you know, democracy before party or party before democracy? Is that a valid concern from your perspective? And again, not necessarily specific to Ohio.
Well, you know, to some extent, you'd have to look at particular secretaries of state, right? But I think the general thought is that people put far too much emphasis on that. The secretaries of state are typically not making those decisions. They're being made by the career officials and by the election experts. To the extent they're making them, they're policy decisions that are made sometime before the election, and not so much what's coming down, you know, in those last minute, the kind of thing everybody's going to be worried about, the kind of things handling the recounts. And most of those decisions tend to be, you know, pretty visible, right? So ultimately, you run the risk of politicized administration. You can always have that. You can even have that in countries that don't use partisan actors as the final call on administration. And at some level, the answer to that becomes a political one of voting people out of office at the next election of reaction there. So, my sort of view again would be much like, I hate to be a broken record, but it's kind of like I say on voter fraud, on vote suppression and so on. These things are real, they happen, and we should watch for them and try to prevent them, but we shouldn't be paranoid that this is going to happen, and we shouldn't presume bad faith every time somebody makes a decision. In a worst case scenario, it's more likely to be just a mistake than some type of bad faith. And I think we'll all be much better off if we approach the election with that that in mind, that we should be generous to people who are trying to do their jobs, and in this case, facing some unique challenges that they've not faced in past elections.
I would agree with the professor. I think we've got to remember that these are people doing the best they can on sometimes the most difficult circumstances, with a lot of pressure from outside groups and trying to interpret and some of it is their philosophy of how elections should be administered. But again, I think they're working to do the best they can. And I know particularly at the local levels, boards of elections, it is incredibly distressing to hear the attacks on the process, because these are your friends and your neighbors. These are, the poll workers are people that work and live in your community, and the people at the boards of elections. We have thousands of poll workers each election cycle. We have hundreds of people who work here as seasonals. We have 46 employees, full-time employees, and they're working, and then multiply that over 88 counties, and you've got people who are working tirelessly to get the job done and to do it fairly and to ensure that it's done accurately, and the checks and balances are in place, and yet their work is being attacked as deficient, and that we're allowing fraud to take place. And so again, we're here to defend democracy, to do it, carry out the elections in a way in which is fair and efficient as possible.
Kari, just to add for maybe a touch of fun, so to speak, if you go back to like that Lyndon Johnson race I talked about earlier, at one point the election judge in Jim Wells County was simply counting votes for Coke Stevenson as being votes for Johnson. And when Coke Stevenson observers complained, they were ordered out of the room, and the counting continued. And when Stevenson sent more observers down there, the county sheriff informed them that he could no longer guarantee their physical safety, so it might be wise for them to leave the county. I just don't think that kind of thing happens. Now, maybe that's not, calming to people, because they still say, well, you could have bad stuff that's not nearly so obvious as that. But I think it's a reminder of how far we've come, really, and how much better things are.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add too is the question around the discretion that secretaries of state have, really does vary a ton from state to state. And in Ohio, for instance, the Secretary of State does have some pretty broad decision-making authority with respect to directives. In other states, that might not be the case, right? And for instance, I know I mentioned the supplemental process previously. That's a decision that was made by a directive. It's a directive that's been in place under both Republican and Democratic administrations, right? So whether or not we agree with it as a policy choice, it's also one that hasn't necessarily been politicized. It's something that, you've actually had both political parties keep in place over the course of time. And at the same point in time too, the level of decision-making authority in Ohio, for instance, has allowed the Secretary of State to say at times, I believe that this restriction that exists in state law actually violates the US Constitution or federal law and requires an adjustment as well. And that's happened too, where, for instance, there are certain restrictions on how people who are late hospitalized can obtain ballots, and there is discretion that's been given to be able to deliver those to people who are covered under the American with Disabilities Act, because there was recognition of the fact that that actually might require a divergence from state law and restrictions on how ballots could be delivered to those voters. So it just differs so much from one location to the next in terms of how secretaries of state can actually have discretionary power.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. We are approaching our final 10 minutes together. So for the final question, it's going to be intentionally broad. And that is, it's still a two-part question. The first is, for you as an individual looking towards the election, what is your greatest concern? And then the second part of that question is, as many of our viewers are attorneys or otherwise participate in the legal field, what advice do you have? What charge would you give for those of us who do have that training as we move towards this election process? And I will start with whoever would like to start.
This is
Professor?
Leonard. I'd say the biggest concern I have is just the misinformation out there. And so again, it's just encouraging, those on the call.
Oh, we lost you. We lost you, Director Leonard. I think you went on mute.
There we go.
We heard those who were on the call, and then after that, you dropped out.
It's just to help get that word out to, again, about the process and to push back on some of this misinformation about voter fraud, about the process, because again, that's really one of the biggest concerns I have is just people not doing the things they need to do because they've either been presented with misinformation or they've been discouraged by what they're hearing out there and just give up on the process. Because I think it would be unfortunate. I really do think a lot of people are requesting their absentee ballots, and the message is getting out there to encourage people to get it back as quickly as possible. And so I sense we may see fewer of the procrastinators than we may have seen in past election cycles, because the message is out there so much about getting it now, getting it requested, getting it back quickly, whether it's hand delivered or through the mail. But again, we think we need to kind of emphasize that message and push back on the misinformation out there that discourages people from exercising the right to vote.
Thank you. Professor Smith, I think I saw you go off mute.
Well, it's only because I thought you might specifically call on me. To the extent I have real concerns, it is simply that if election night is extremely close, either at the presidential level or for control of the U.S. Senate, and in particular in the latter case, if it's apparent that, for example, Mr. Biden's going to win the presidency, that there will be, again, a lot of overreaction, nastiness, perhaps violence. And this is where I think people just need, again, to say we need to have good faith, let the system play out. People should not forfeit their right to challenge, ballots, or to challenge the denial of ballots, or to demand recounts. But this can be done in an orderly fashion in which we presume good faith from one another. So it's, I hate to say it, there's not much of a solution, but it's a little bit of the old pogo argument, from the old comic strip. It's like we've met the enemy and they are us. And I think if, there will be lawyers out there, there'll be good ones who will be watching out for your partisan interests and so on. So if it comes down to a nail biter, just sit back and think of it as a good show, and, eat some popcorn. And again, if in the end your candidate loses, there will be another election in just 2 years to take over Congress, and in 4 years for the president. And it seems like this gets ratcheted up every 4 years now. I hear everybody like, oh, this is the end all. And 4 years later, we're still here. And I think that'll be the case in 2024.
And I guess, I think I have similar concerns to what have already been expressed, but I think, there are a lot of states that are going to see an enormous increase in mail or absentee voting, where rules have changed this year. Ohio has had no excuse absentee voting for some time. People are more familiar with it in the state. But I think that there is, a lot of education that actually needs to still happen in different states about how to utilize the processes, what timing people need to try to follow. USPS is urging folks to, sent letters to states urging people to request ballots sooner. But even those timelines haven't necessarily always been enough. So I think that there's just, in order for people to able to understand how to successfully navigate the process, like some education that needs to be done still. And then similarly, concerns about, where we'll stand if, the election is close, or what it appears is happening on election night actually ends up kind of shifting, and what reactions will be to that. And then I think the advice is the same we discussed earlier, which is if people can be poll workers, especially if they're in areas that don't have poll workers, sign up to be one. You can engage in election protection work. And hopefully just, to the extent that you're looking for ways to engage, I think those are two very important ways to do so.
Thank you so much. We are down to just the final few moments, so I just want to extend a huge thank you to each of our panelists for attending today, for providing the information and expertise that you have, and I know that this will prove to be something that will move forward as a resource beyond just the legal community. We will make sure to disseminate this recording for those of you who are still on the call. It will be posted on our website and other places as well to make sure that this information is out there. So that we do our part to ensure that we, extend the calm, so to speak, but also so that people are well informed about what to expect. For those of you who are with us for the first time, I want to encourage you to return with us again. We will be meeting again for a second community conversation, that will close out this two-part series on inclusive democracy. Our next event will be election dissection, popular votes, electoral college, and peaceful transitions of power. It is strategically placed about a week after the election. It'll be on November 12th. 2020 from 12 to 1:30, also on Zoom. So we hope that you will join us. If you didn't get your questions answered today, or you think of other questions, do feel free to send them to us right here at the CBA. You can call our office. We do have our one person here on staff who will be here to take those calls and make sure that they get routed to the proper person. So again, we thank everyone for being here, and we wish you good health, and to see you again on November 12th. Have a great day.